There's a documentary called War Photographer that was made in 2001, and I thought I'd start this video by sharing an extract from that documentary with you, because in it we hear the voice of a war photographer, and he's describing the difficulty of the work, the horrible things that he has to witness, but he also talks very interestingly about why he does what he does, what his purpose is as he sees it. So I'd like you to think about that as I play you the 3-minute extract. Why is he doing this work? What does he think he can achieve? And then we'll go on to looking at Caroline Duffy's poem, in which her war photographer seems to have very similar reflections.
Why photograph war? Is it possible to put an end to a form of human behavior which has existed throughout history by means of photography? The proportions of that notion seem ridiculously out of balance, yet that very idea has motivated me. For me, the strength of photography lies in its ability to evoke a sense of humanity. If war is an attempt to negate humanity, then photography can be perceived as the opposite of war. And if it's used well, it can be a powerful ingredient in the antidote to war. In a way, if an individual assumes the risk of placing himself in the middle of a war in order to communicate to the rest of the world what is happening, he's trying to negotiate for peace. Perhaps that's the reason why those in charge of perpetuating a war do not like to have photographers around. In the field, what you experience is extremely immediate. What you see is not an image on a page in a magazine 10,000 miles away with an advertisement for Rolex watches on the next page. What you see is unmitigated pain, injustice, and misery. It's occurred to me that if everyone could be there just once to see for themselves what white phosphorus does to the face of a child, or what unspeakable pain is caused by the impact of a single bullet, or how a jagged piece of shrapnel can rip someone's leg off. If everyone could be there to see for themselves the fear and the grief just one time, then they would understand that nothing is worth letting things get to the point where that happens to even one person, let alone thousands. But everyone cannot be there, and that is why photographers go there, to show them, to reach out and grab them and make them stop what they're doing and pay attention to what is going on. To create pictures powerful enough to overcome the diluting effects of the mass media and shake people out of their indifference. To protest, and by the strength of that protest, to make others protest.
Does it cause them any health problems?
Asap bisa asap belerang kan bisa bikin mata perih juga. Ada.
That was the voice of an award-winning war photographer, James Nachtwey, and he began that extract by asking why photograph war. And then he goes on to explain that he does this because he wants war to stop, basically, and he thinks that by capturing a sense of the real horror of war, he's helping in some kind of a peace negotiation. He feels that his images make a difference, make it more likely that wars will stop, because he thinks that his images raise awareness and galvanise people into taking action to stop crimes against humanity. So that's why he takes pictures of war. Caroline Duffy's war photographer asks the same question in the poem, but as you'll see, his answer is much more ambivalent than James Nachtwey's, the poem in the end isn't a very optimistic one.
In his darkroom, he is finally alone with spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. The only light is red and softly glows, as though this were a church, and he a priest, preparing to intone a mass. Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh, all flesh is grass. He has a job to do. Solutions slop in trays beneath his hands, which did not tremble then, though seem to now. Rural England, home again to ordinary pain, which simple weather can dispel, to fields which don't explode beneath the feet of running children in a nightmare heat. Something is happening. A stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes, a half-formed ghost. He remembers the cries of this man's wife, how he sought approval without words to do what someone must, and how the blood stained into foreign dust. 100 agonies in black and white, from which his editor will pick out 5 or 6 for Sunday's supplement. The reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. From the aeroplane, he stares impassively at where he earns his living, and they do not care.
It's interesting that a poem describing chaos, horror, should be written in such a regular form. The poem comprises 4 stanzas of equal length, they're all 6 lines long, and each stanza closes with a rhyming couplet, and that conveys a sense of rounding off, of closure at the end of each stanza. Very tidy way of writing, one could argue. This is interesting, given that the poem is describing the horror and chaos of war, but perhaps it reflects the fact that the war photographer is now trying to make sense of what he's seen, of those traumatic experiences, perhaps trying to contain his pain and anger within some kind of a form, within the structure. Like Prayer Before Birth, this could be described an anti-war poem, but it has nothing of the emotion and anger and rage that we hear in Prayer Before Birth. It's much more detached, almost matter of fact, in the way that it describes the impact of war. And I think there are 2 reasons for that. Firstly, in order to do the job of a war photographer, you would have to be able to detach yourself in order to hold your camera steady and photograph the horrific sights in front of you. So detachment is an essential part of the job. Another reason for the objectivity of this poem is the fact that it reflects the medium which Carol Ann Duffy is exploring. So she's writing about war photography, and when we look at a photograph, we don't know, do we, how the sufferer is feeling, what it's like for them to be in that moment. We just see from the outside the image. And the poem works in the same way. It gives us a series of vivid images. We're looking from the outside at events, and never at any point are we taken inside the head of either the war photographer or the victims that he's capturing through his images. The opening stanza sets the scene, and we meet the war photographer in his darkroom, finally alone. That word finally suggesting a sense of relief. He describes his footage as spools of suffering, and the word spools there emphasises the sheer scale of the human misery that he's brought back with him through his images. He's setting them out in ordered rows, so he's trying to make sense of all of this chaos. And earlier, in structure and form, I talked about the form of the poem itself seeming to impose order and structure on the chaotic. In the next few lines, Caroline Duffy compares him to a priest intoning a mass, and this lends the work that he does a sense of spirituality. Like a priest, he's exposed through his work to human suffering. The red light in the dark room also echoes the light that we find in churches, representing the presence of God. But of course, here the word red also connotes blood and death. This priest, the war photographer, isn't preparing for a mass at all, we're reminded. He's preparing images of war. But there is a moral purpose in what he's doing, and that, for me, makes this comparison with a priest very significant. The stanza ends with a list of war-torn zones: Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh, each fixed with a full stop to emphasise them and to suggest the final stages of the fixing of an image. The listing of those places also reinforces this idea suggested by Spools of Suffering that misery, war is everywhere. All flesh is grass is a fragment from the Bible, and that ends this stanza on a cynical, sad note, because that phrase seems to suggest that human life is nothing. It's not important. It's a view, in fact, that the war photographer is trying to challenge through his work. The next stanza begins in a more business-like tone. He has a job to do. The phrase solution slop is onomatopoeic. We can hear almost the paper slopping about in the trays as he develops his images. But perhaps the word solutions works on another level as well, and Duffy is referring to this notion that photographers hope and are motivated by the idea that their work can be part of a solution. In a way, they have to believe that, otherwise they are simply profiting or making a living out of human suffering, which would be an impossible idea to live with. Clearly, though, this war photographer does care, and we see that in the fact that his hands are trembling as he develops his images. They didn't tremble then. Detachment was presumably essential for him to do the job, but they tremble now. We also have in this stanza the first example of contrast. Duffy makes effective use of this throughout the rest of the poem to highlight the important theme of injustice. So he goes from his horrific images slopping about in the tray to rural England, full stop. Here, pain is ordinary, which suggests that what he's seen is extraordinary. And it's an extraordinary image that ends this stanza because Duffy describes children running across a field, hoping it doesn't explode beneath their feet, and she makes reference to a nightmare heat, so we have a hellish vision of what it is to be a child in a war-torn zone. That image also evokes a very famous war photograph, the one of children running naked and terrified out of a napalm-bombed village during the Vietnam War. And that's a photograph that is credited with bringing forward the end of the conflict in Vietnam because it was so influential on American opinion. It created a strong sense of enough is enough, this is wrong, what we're doing in Vietnam is wrong. And I think in this poem, Caroline Duffy is regretting the fact that images simply don't have this kind of power anymore. We've seen many like it since, and none of them have changed policy in the way that that one did. Something is happening is a short, emphatic sentence that injects drama into this poem. We've got a change, and we can almost feel the photographer's suspense as an image emerges in front of his eyes. It's the image of a half-formed ghost, and that works on two levels. On the one hand, it's a ghost because it's just beginning to peer out of the photographic paper, But obviously, what we're seeing here is a dying man, so that's another reason why he is a ghost. He's with his wife, this dying man, and it's clearly an intimate moment, and therefore the photographer, with great sensitivity, is asking for approval to take the picture. He doesn't speak the same language, so he asks without words. But he must do what someone must. So there's a sense of vocation here. This is an important photograph to take. It matters because human life matters and loss matters. As in the first stanza, the importance of the war photographer's work is emphasised. Here he is, again, like a priest, bearing witness to a man's dying moments. The final stanza of the poem focuses on the way these images are received by readers, and we get a sense of the war photographer's cynicism and frustration. He's produced 100 agonies in black and white, but clearly his editor is unmoved by these because he simply picks out 5 or 6 for Sunday's supplement. The fact that the photos are going in a supplement shows they're not even front page news in our country. They are in the section of the paper that is typically about entertainment. So the poem asks, is that ultimately what these images really are? We hear that the reader's eyeballs prick with tears, and there's something disingenuous about that. Duffy is suggesting that all of us enjoy feeling compassionate from time to time. People watch a sad film for a good cry, don't they? So doubtless the editors have chosen pictures that will stir us emotionally because people like to be stirred. But the pictures haven't been chosen to change anything. And there's a strong sense in this poem that nothing will change because it comes full cycle. And at the end of the poem, the war photographer is heading off on his next assignment in order to return with his next set of agonies in black and white. There's a real bitterness in the last 2 lines of the poem. The war photographer is leaving, staring impassively back down on his home country. Impassively suggests an indifference, a detachment, a feeling that he doesn't belong there anymore. But neither does he belong to the conflict zones to which he returns, so he's lost his place in the world through this work. And he's lost his faith in the idea that it might matter, that it might change anything, because he looks down and reflects on the fact that they do not care. They being readers of the newspaper that he takes his photographs for. So what really is the point in what he does? I think Caroline Duffy is doing 2 important things with this poem. Firstly, she's reminding us of the horror of war, the human tragedy that is war. And to do that, she focuses on a couple of individual scenes. The dying man, his traumatised wife, the children tearing across the field, to remind us of the real human suffering that war creates. Ironically though, and this is the second point, the war photographer is trying to do exactly the same thing through his images. But Caroline Duffy is suggesting in the poem that those images don't have any impact anymore because we see so many of them. We've become completely desensitised to the suffering of our fellow human beings in faraway places. We might feel something for a moment or 2 when we look at a particularly powerful image, but then we very quickly forget. What we discover at the end of the poem is a real bitterness in the heart of the war photographer, who's very aware of this. He realises that when his picture editor chooses which photo to use, it isn't necessarily for the right reasons. And he leaves the country for his next assignment, looking down and feeling detached from all of us back at home, because we don't know what it's like. We can't know what it's like. And the war photographer seems to conclude that we simply don't care what it's like for all the pictures that he takes and all the work that he does. I think it's fair to say that Carol Ann Duffy identifies with the war photographer in a way through their art. They're both trying to do the same thing. They're both trying to raise awareness. They're both trying to make people less complacent about what's going on in the world. And both presumably share the same frustration. So there's a respect that Carol Ann Duffy has for the war photographer and what he does. But I've already said that detachment is essential to the meaning of this poem, and it's therefore appropriate that she writes about this war photographer in the third person. We don't hear his voice in the poem. She describes him from the outside.